This is the second part of a video series called Writing About Literature, MLA Standards and Best Practices for Quoting and Documenting Sources. This second video is focused more on technique, about ways to incorporate quoted material into your essay in a way that is effective and that does not interfere with the flow of your writing, the presentation of your ideas. So we're going to start by talking about some common mistakes that students make in their writing. I'll call it quote dropping, and I'm going to give you a few examples of quote dropping here. One of the most common mistakes is in citing sources is failing to provide sufficient context for quotations. So a quote drop, and that's just a word that I've come to use over the years, is when a direct quotation appears suddenly and unexpectedly, usually as a sentence unto itself. A dropped quotation often leaves the reader uncertain as to its purpose, since it is not connected to anything that comes before it. Take a look at this example. So the writer ends the first sentence with a period, then inserts the quotation, and most quote drops look something like this. Fortunately, in this example, there's a pronoun, the word there, at the beginning of the quote, which clearly refers to Wing Biddlebaum's hands in the writer's sentence that leads up to the quote. But the writer's sentence doesn't really say much about the hands. It just says they're important. Instead, the writer drops in the quote to do the explaining for him, and quotations should not do this. You should never use quotations to do your work. Quotations should always support your claims, your assertions, and they shouldn't be used to illustrate weak or obvious remarks like that Wing Biddlebaum's hands are important. Of course they are. Anyone who's read the story knows that already. So this writer really needs to make a stronger statement about Wing Biddlebaum's hands before inserting the quote. Writer leans way too heavy on the quote. Here's another example. Take a look at this one. So here's the same weak opening sentence, but with a different quote dropped behind it. And this one is even worse than the last one because it is less clear how the quotation relates to the writer's point. The passage describes what happens between Biddlebaum and George Willard, but it doesn't have that much to do with Biddlebaum's hands or what makes them important. So the quote drop doesn't require the writer to give much thought to how his evidence is supporting his ideas. Here's the last example. This is pretty common, something like this. The writer drops a quote and then proceeds to tell the reader what it means, what the quote means, or why the quote is important. You should never do this. By the time your readers get to a quotation, they should already know why they're reading it. So in the example here, the writer started a paragraph with a quote drop, which is the worst of all. Starting a paragraph with a quote is never a good idea. Every paragraph in your essay should begin with one of your own claims, something that you're trying to prove, not somebody else's. So direct quotations support your claims. They do not make claims for you. This writer starts the paragraph with a quote and then says, this quote shows. It's all backwards, all backwards. This is another form of quote dropping. There are two ways to avoid doing this, two ways to incorporate quotes seamlessly into your writing. And I call these methods attachment and integration. So on the right, I give you a quick illustration of both using the same passages that were dropped in the previous examples. This one is attachment, and this one is integration. Now I'm going to show you how to do this. We'll start with attachment. It's easier to understand and use. There are two kinds of attachment, actually. So there's simple attachment And then there's complex attachment. We'll get to complex attachment in a moment, but there are three major methods that you're going to learn. The two forms of attachment, simple and complex, and then integration, which is the most difficult for students, so we'll save that one for last. But starting with simple attachment, when you use attachment, you are usually quoting an entire sentence. It's important to understand. When you're using the attachment method, whether it's simple or complex, you are usually quoting an entire sentence or sometimes multiple sentences rather than individual words or short phrases. So there are two different approaches a writer may take to attaching quotations, simple and complex, as I said. Simple attachment typically involves writing a short introductory phrase that links the quotation to a subject, as in these examples. So here I've highlighted in yellow the short phrase that introduces the quote. Here's another example. And those are fine. But the problem is that if you do it too much, it gets redundant, it seems repetitive, and it starts to seem kind of lazy, and you're not really linking the quotes to your claims. You're not really linking the quotes to assertions you're making that need to be proven. So complex attachment is stronger, and it requires the writer to connect the quotation to an idea, to a claim that the writer's making. So the writer makes a claim or observation about something, like a literary text, then uses a quote from that text to illustrate it. And this is more effective than simple attachment because it foregrounds the writer's ideas and not the source. So I've given you two examples here. Highlighted in blue are the claims or observations that I'm making. And then I attach a quote after the statement that illustrates what I just wrote. You might pause here and take a moment to read these and think about them. Use a colon to attach the citation to your claim or observation. This is a crucial punctuation mark because it cues the reader that there is a relationship between the quotation and your idea or your claim. If it's just a period there, it risks looking like a drop quote. So the colon is important. So let's talk about hanging quotes. This is another form of complex attachment. When writing short papers, it is best to avoid quoting passages that take up more than 4 consecutive lines on a page. Long quotations take up space that you need, particularly in a short essay, to present your own ideas. Most of the time, long quotes can be trimmed down, and I tend to discourage beginning writers from using them. However, there are occasions when a writer needs to include the entirety of a crucial passage. This is especially true in poetry. So you need to know how to format long quotes. First, a long quotation, this is a passage of more than 4 lines when it's prose, 4 lines if it's poetry, is always attached. Okay, long quotations are always attached using complex attachment. Second, it is not enclosed in quotation marks, but formatted as a block of text that's indented 1/2 inch from the left margin. So it's a hanging indent. Third, terminal punctuation now comes before the parenthetical citation, not after. So the quotation marks are removed. Now the punctuation comes after the parenthetical citation. So the right margin and line spacing remain unchanged. Sometimes students want to bump the right margin in on hanging quotes as well. The right margin remains unchanged. The purpose of this format and the purpose of the hanging indent is to make clear to the reader where a long quotation begins and ends. So I'll illustrate this with a couple of examples. So here's an example of a long quote. Just imagine you're reading this essay for the first time and you see those opening quotation marks up there 3 lines down, and then you're reading and you're reading and you're reading and you're reading, and you finally get to the closing quotation marks. If you're reading thoughtfully and slowly, you might get to those closing quotation marks and realize, wow, I've been reading a quotation this whole time. You've forgotten that you were, perhaps, and then you start to wonder where it started. So if it's longer than 4 lines, this is the way you deal with it. So you create an attached quote. There are no quotation marks. The whole thing is indented a 1/2 inch. And the terminal punctuation now ends with the quotation and does not come after the parenthetical citation. And that's how you do hanging quotes. It gets a little more complex when you're doing poetry and drama. And we'll look at that in part 3 of this series. So finally, we're going to talk about integration. This is another effective way to incorporate quotations into your writing, and it's very useful for short essays where you don't have a lot of space. Integration is the most difficult of the 3 methods, but it allows you to fuse together your claim, your observation, with the textual evidence that you're going to use to support it. And usually, this is accomplished not by quoting entire sentences as an attachment, but by selecting crucial words or vivid phrases and then building a sentence around them. And this creates a seamlessness that will make your prose more concise and easier to read. So here's an example where I quoted a long passage. It almost, and it's not quite 4 lines long. It's almost would need to be formatted as a hanging quote. But what I've done is I highlighted in yellow the things, the phrases that I thought were most interesting, most vivid, most important. And instead of quoting this whole passage or using ellipses to cut stuff out, I just integrated those pieces that I highlighted in yellow. Now they're highlighted in blue as integrated quotes. So you might pause here for a moment, take a look at what I've done, look at the example above, which is not good, look at the example below, which is much better. You'll notice that in the bottom, I actually use an ellipsis. In this example, I actually pulled material from 2 different pages. And one of the really great advantages of integrating quotes is I can gather support for a claim or idea from different parts of the story and then quote them in the same sentence, just putting pieces here and there. And that's why I have 2 parenthetical citations from different pages in that example. So those are the methods of incorporating quotations into your essays. And in the 3rd part of this series, we will talk about some of the special problems that come with quoting literary texts.